The world is not ending with a bang, but with a balance sheet. The single greatest threat to global stability, to your savings, and to the future of every American family is not war, famine, or plague. It is the cold, calculated, and mathematically unstable design of the system itself. We are not facing a recession. We are confronting an inescapable debt paradox, a feature, not a bug, in the architecture of the modern empire. Look at the numbers. They are so vast they cease to be statistics and become an abstract confession of failure. The national debt clock spins not just as a measure of borrowing, but as the relentless metronome counting down to a systemic collapse. When empires fall, they rarely do so from external force. They collapse under the weight of an internal disease, the terminal stage of financial decay. Rome, the most powerful empire the world had ever known, dissolved into chaos in what amounted to 3 days of final, catastrophic destabilization. France's Third Republic, seemingly robust, fell in 6 weeks under the weight of military and financial unpreparedness. And the Soviet Union, the monolithic adversary of the West, vanished in a mere 900 days once the central rot of its economic model became undeniable. These timelines shatter the illusion of gradual decline. They reveal that the final, most dangerous stage of collapse is characterized by blinding speed triggered by a seemingly minor financial or geopolitical shock. The hidden truth, the dangerous knowledge few analysts dare to voice, is that this collapse is not accidental. The architects of this system, the elite families and financial institutions, understood the mechanics of debt and leverage with mechanical precision. They built a financial edifice that is structurally guaranteed to fail, not randomly, but predictably, ensuring that when the inevitable implosion occurs, the wealth is vacuumed up from the broad populace and concentrated into the hands of the very few who design the off-ramps. The American dollar, the global reserve currency, is the ultimate engine of this wealth transfer. Every single dollar created since 1971 is a promise, a lien against the future production and prosperity of the American citizen. The endless printing, the quantitative easing, the stimulus packages, the trillions in opaque instruments, is not stimulus. It is the deliberate dilution of the middle class's stored wealth. I have spent years deconstructing the blueprints of imperial finance, and what I found is a recurring pattern, a template for wealth extraction and systemic breakdown that spans millennia. This pattern is defined by stages. Stage 1 is the foundational promise, establishing the currency as a reserve or store of value, often backed by a commodity or, in the modern era, by military power and institutional trust. Stage 2 involves the incremental abandonment of fiscal discipline, moving the state apparatus from responsible stewardship to opportunistic borrowing. This is the moment the true architects begin to leverage the system against its citizens, knowing that the cost of servicing the debt will eventually necessitate inflation. Stage 3 is the acceleration of debt, specifically debt that cannot be serviced by tax revenue alone. It requires the state to enter the market as the largest, most disruptive borrower, driving interest rates up and starving productive private enterprise of capital. The inescapable conclusion of this stage is the financialization of everything, where true value creation is replaced by speculative trading in derivatives and paper assets. This system is designed for one thing: the infinite expansion of centralized power and the mechanical, systematic transfer of real assets, land, gold, productive capacity, from the masses to the elite few who control the debt issuance. The system is mathematically unstable, and the process of decay, once initiated, is impossible to reverse. We are now far beyond the point of no return. Now, let's deconstruct the architects, the blueprints, and the final stages of the collapse we are currently living through. To understand the speed at which the final curtain drops, we must deconstruct the historical precedents. The collapse of an empire is often viewed through the misleading lens of slow decline, yet the data shows the terminal stage is always characterized by a hyper-rapid failure of central authority and a complete loss of confidence in the currency. We are talking about the difference between a chronic illness and acute, multi-organ system failure. Consider the Western Roman Empire. For decades, historians pointed to gradual decay, corruption, moral laxity, and slow migration pressures. But the financial investigator sees a far more precise mechanism at work, leading to the sharpest point of failure in 476 AD. Rome did not fall to superior external armies. It was hollowed out by coinage debasement. From the reign of Nero, to the 3rd century, the silver content in the denarius, the core currency, was systematically reduced from near pure silver to less than 5%. This was stage 4 of financial collapse, the deliberate destruction of the money supply as a substitute for true taxation, an inflationary tax borne entirely by the common citizen who held the coins. By the time the emperors were minting copper coins with a silver wash, trust had evaporated. When an economic shock, military defeat, and pressure on the frontiers finally hit, there was zero financial resilience. The mechanism of collapse was instantaneous. When the central government could no longer finance its legions with credible money, the legions simply stopped defending the frontiers. The final act was not a siege, it was a systemic failure of liquidity and trust. Rome fell in 3 days. Not literally, but in the time it took for the last Roman emperor to be deposed and for the political and military structures to stop functioning as a cohesive unit. The financial architecture had collapsed, and the political structure dissolved immediately after. The French collapse in 1940 offers a stark, 6-week warning. The Third Republic was perceived as a great power, secured by the Maginot Line, a symbol of industrial and defensive might. But the true collapse was already rooted in stage 5. Economic and political complacency coupled with chronic, underreported military overextension. When the German shockwave hit, the military hardware was secondary to the political will, which had been eroded by decades of internal division and financial neglect. Crucially, the elite had mentally disengaged from the nation's defense, prioritizing their own security and capital preservation. The 6 weeks of fighting were merely the physical manifestation of a spiritual and financial collapse that had occurred years prior. The state's collapse was swift because the public and the ruling class had no shared vested interest in maintaining the failing structure. The speed was the result of a pre-existing vacuum of trust. The Soviet Union's implosion, spanning roughly 900 days from the failure of perestroika to the final dissolution in 1991, provides the most comprehensive modern blueprint for the American situation. The USSR was a pure command economy defined by the total failure of central planning, an environment of infinite debt and infinite spending disconnected from any market reality. Its currency, the ruble, was non-convertible and backed only by the promise of the state, mirroring the ultimate fiat nature of the modern dollar. The financial failure hit in the mid-1980 seconds, fueled by plummeting oil prices and the immense, unserviceable cost of its imperial, military overextension. This was stage 6, the terminal stage where the cost of maintaining the empire exceeds its productive capacity, forcing the state to finance its existence entirely through the printing press, or, in the Soviet case, through state debt mechanisms. When Gorbachev attempted modest reform, it was not the external pressure but the immediate internal exposure of the economy's deep, irreparable rot that triggered the end. Once the people realized the ruble was worthless and the shelves were bare, confidence vanished. Within 900 days, the empire fractured along every fault line: ethnic, economic, and political. The rapidity of the end demonstrates that when confidence goes, and when the architects can no longer effectively conceal the bankruptcy of the central system, the collapse is systemic, total, and nonlinear. The time from undeniable systemic failure to final dissolution is measured in months, not decades. The U.S. is now displaying every single one of these preconditions. The mechanical precision of imperial decay can be mapped onto a predictable, 7-stage model, where each stage is mathematically driven by the failures of fiat currency and the infinite appetite for war financing. The architects do not merely observe this pattern, they exploit it. Understanding these mechanics is vital because it exposes the blueprints currently being executed against the global economy. Stage 1. Monetary foundation. The promise. This is the establishment of a currency backed by a credible store of value or military guarantor. In the U.S. context, this lasted from the founding until 1971. The public retains faith that the unit of value represents a claim on real wealth. Stage 2. Credit expansion. The temptation. The central authority discovers the immense political power derived from credit creation. Loans are issued far exceeding reserves. This seeds the first, invisible inflation, as more claims are issued against the same pool of real assets. The elite recognize that controlling the issuance of money is vastly more profitable than merely producing goods. Stage 3. Financialization, the disconnect. Productive enterprise is systematically disadvantaged in favor of speculative finance. Banks become the core engine of the economy, not manufacturers. Leverage becomes infinite. Complex derivative markets are created opaque instruments designed primarily to transfer risk to the system and away from the architects. This is where wealth concentration accelerates rapidly, as capital gains dramatically outstrip wage growth. Stage 4. Currency debasement. The inflationary tax. When the state's spending fueled by military conflicts and domestic welfare programs cannot be met through taxation, the architects resort to the printing press. This is not benign quantitative easing. It is the deliberate devaluation of the existing money stock. Every unit of currency issued is a debt instrument that transfers future purchasing power from the holder to the issuer. This stage is marked by persistent structural inflation that cannot be adequately measured by official statistics, as it is designed to obscure the true cost of imperial overextension. Stage 5. Imperial overextension, the breaking point. The empire's military and financial commitments span the globe, requiring impossible levels of capital expenditure. The U.S. military machine, in its current state, is an inescapable drain that cannibalizes the nation's productive capital. The cost of maintaining global hegemony, of underwriting treaties, and of financing proxy conflicts reaches an inflection point where the foreign holdings of the currency begin to decline, signaling a loss of global trust. Foreign states, the consumers of the reserve currency, begin to divest, searching for tangible assets, gold, commodities, or land, to shield themselves from the inflationary tax exported by the issuing nation. This is the stage where the architects, recognizing the nearing collapse of the structure, begin aggressively extracting their own capital into hardened, liquid assets outside the system. Stage 6. Loss of confidence and internal decay, the terminal phase. This is the stage of irreversible structural decay. The debt becomes so large, currently approaching the $34 trillion mark, that the entire political and economic apparatus is focused solely on servicing the interest payments. The capital required for necessary infrastructure, education, and innovation is diverted to feed the debt monster. Social trust collapses as the middle class is crushed between structural inflation and wage stagnation. Political polarization becomes extreme, as the populace, sensing the imminent failure of the system, fragments into antagonistic factions. The elite, fully aware of the mathematical instability, retreat further behind their financial fortifications. The U.S. is now definitively situated in Stage 6. We are witnessing the hallmark indicators, the unsustainable interest payments, the weaponization of the central bank, and the pervasive loss of faith in the integrity of every major institution, from the markets to the media. Stage 7. Systemic failure, the collapse rewind. This is the moment when a final, non-recoverable shock hits the system. It could be a sovereign debt default, a rapid, coordinated rejection of the dollar by a bloc of foreign creditors, or a black swan event that exposes the underlying fragility of the fractional reserve and derivative system. The failure is rapid because the complexity built up in stages 3 through 6 ensures that when one part fails, the cascading domino effect is immediate and absolute. The speed of the fall, the 3 days for Rome, the 6 weeks for France, is the mechanical outcome of the preceding decades of engineered fragility. The modern financial world, driven by instantaneous, interconnected global capital flows and algorithmic trading, will ensure that Stage 7, when it arrives, will be the fastest collapse in human history. The application of the 7-stage collapse model to the contemporary United States economy is not a matter of speculation. It is an exercise in rigorous financial forensics. The evidence overwhelmingly confirms that the U.S. is entrenched in Stage 6, the terminal phase. The indicators are flashing red with mathematical certainty, revealing an economy designed for systemic extraction, not sustainable growth. The primary undeniable metric is the parabolic curve of the national debt. We are currently facing interest payments on the public debt that are set to eclipse annual defense spending, rapidly becoming the single largest expenditure line item. This is the definition of a failed state finance mechanism. When a nation's productive capacity is dedicated solely to servicing past debt rather than investing in future growth or stability, the system has entered a permanent state of cannibalization. The architects understand that once the interest cost crosses a certain percentage of GDP, recovery through organic growth becomes mathematically impossible. You must either default, inflate the currency into oblivion, or radically cut the core functions of the state. The choice being made, with mechanical precision, is inflation. The silent, systematic destruction of purchasing power to reduce the real value of the debt owed. Consider the nature of wealth concentration. Stage 6 is defined by a Gilded Age disparity that fundamentally destabilizes social cohesion. The top 1% now controls a disproportionate share of the national wealth, a level unseen since the eve of the Great Depression. This is not accidental. The Federal Reserve's policies, implemented since the 2008 crisis, quantitative easing and near-zero interest rates, were sold as stimulus, but they functioned as the ultimate wealth transfer mechanism. By making credit infinitely cheap for those with collateral, the asset-holding elite, and simultaneously driving up the cost of living for those reliant on wages, the system mechanically transferred hundreds of billions from the working and middle class into the financial assets owned by the elite. This is the explicit blueprint of the architects, collapsing the middle class's buffer to ensure they have no financial resilience when the final shock arrives. The terminal phase is also marked by the weaponization of the central bank. Historically, central banks are supposed to be impartial custodians of currency stability. In Stage 6, the U.S. Federal Reserve has transformed into the primary funding mechanism for infinite government spending, losing all pretense of independence. This politicization guarantees that the currency will continue to be debased to finance endless debt, regardless of the inflationary consequence for the average citizen. This is a critical indicator of systemic rot, when the supposed guarantor of the currency becomes its largest, most reckless destroyer. Furthermore, we are observing the final, crucial precursor of collapse, the rapid de-dollarization trend globally. Foreign nations are not waiting for the U.S. to self-correct. They recognize the mathematical instability of the dollar as a reserve currency, backed by infinite debt and zero fiscal discipline. The movement toward alternative currencies, gold backing, and commodity-based trade agreements signals the beginning of the end for the petrodollar hegemony. When the world no longer needs the dollar to trade energy and commodities, the massive demand for U.S. debt instruments collapses. This is the point where the debt crisis, currently an internal problem, becomes an immediate and existential global crisis for the United States. Rome's legions failed because their money failed. The U.S. empire is now facing the same mechanical failure. The final shock is not a matter of if, but when. As the global financial system prepares for the moment, the world's largest borrower can no longer credibly service its obligations. We are standing on the precipice of the collapse rewind, where decades of financial deception unravel in months. We stand at the threshold of Stage 7, systemic failure. The mathematical certainty of this collapse demands not passive observation, but immediate, decisive action. The countdown is measured not in decades, but in the rapid acceleration of the terminal phase indicators. The final, non-recoverable shock could materialize as a catastrophic failure in the opaque derivatives market, a sudden global interest rate spike that renders the national debt unserviceable, or a coordinated move by sovereign nations to reject the dollar as the primary medium of trade. When it hits, the speed of the failure will defy every conventional expectation, echoing the 3 days of Rome's final dissolution. For the individual, survival demands a complete rejection of the financial paradigms that define the 20th century. The collapsing system is defined by paper assets, debt instruments, and centralized control. Therefore, the only viable off-ramp must be defined by tangible assets, liquidity outside the banking system, and decentralization. The architects who built this system have already secured their positions. Your primary mandate is to decouple your personal prosperity from the impending failure of their structure. First, and most critically, is the acquisition of hard, non-fiat, non-political assets. Historically, during every currency collapse, gold and silver have functioned as the ultimate store of value. These are universal currencies that bear no counterparty risk and cannot be inflated by a central bank's printing press. They are the only true hedge against the mechanical destruction of paper wealth. This is not investment advice, it is survival mechanics. You must move capital out of the vulnerable, centralized financial system and into assets you physically control. Second, the importance of liquidity outside the digital banking architecture cannot be overstated. When confidence vanishes in Stage 7, Bank holidays and capital controls become the inevitable response of the failing state attempting to stabilize the panic. The ability to transact outside the digital surveillance grid, possessing physical, spendable cash, and barter-ready commodities will determine immediate personal security and resilience. The elite are preparing for a world where digital transactions are tracked and controlled. You must prepare for a world where cash is king simply because it remains decentralized. Third, focus on local, redundant systems of security and production. The collapse of the central financial structure will inevitably lead to disruption in logistics, supply chains, and centralized utilities. Investing in skills, localized community networks, and the capacity for self-sufficiency, specifically in food, water, and power, is the most profound insurance policy against systemic shock. When the grand, complex machine of the modern state fails, simplicity and localization become the paramount drivers of survival. The painful realization is that the system you were born into, the promise of infinite growth and perpetual stability, was merely a sophisticated wealth extraction mechanism designed to reach this terminal stage. The architects have played their final hand: infinite debt and the destruction of the currency. Your task is to recognize the stage, execute the off-ramp strategy, and ensure that your family's prosperity does not become collateral damage in the collapse of the American empire. The collapse is mathematically certain. Your personal resilience is the only variable that remains within your control. The relentless cycle of imperial collapse, documented across 2 millennia, shows us one immutable truth. The most dangerous time is not the decade of slow decline, but the final, shocking velocity of the terminal phase. We have deconstructed the blueprints, identified the architects, and confirmed the U.S. position deep within Stage 6. This is not a time for fear, but for calculated action. The moment for passive hope has passed. The data dictates a single path. Divest from the engineered fragility of the system and secure your future with tangible value. The warning has been delivered with mathematical certainty. What you do with it now is the only variable that counts.